So welcome to the final installment of Schnee Reads Call of the Wild. This is assignment 18, chapter 7, part 2. This is the last reading in our book. As always, we are looking at the things in the novel that affect our character, specifically with regards to the theme of how Buck is becoming wilder throughout the book. And he is still struggling with that internal conflict at this point of should he leave John Thornton? Should he stay behind? Well, that decision is going to be made today. You are going to look at the ultimate event that allows Buck to turn completely wild and why it was really the only thing that could happen in order for Buck's wild side to completely come out. And as always, you are going to answer questions based on details from the text. So what happened last time? So the men were able to use the $1,600 that Buck won them to explore and look for the fabled lost cabin where it's said that a great fortune can be found. Buck grows bored with not much to do and begins dreaming of the primitive man once again. In his dreams, he goes on many adventures with him. Buck also hears a wolf call from the forest and begins to follow it. He runs with the wolves at night, and during the day, he stays near camp with Thornton. Still not fully able to leave. However, Buck starts staying away longer and longer from camp and finds it hard to resist the call, even though he still loves Thornton. He does always come back, but now it takes him longer. So maybe he's out for a couple of days and then he comes back. But he's still unable to resist the call, but unable to leave Thornton at this point. All right, so now that we've finished this introduction video, we are going to move on to reading chapter 7, part 2, Call of the Wild, the last part in our novel. And as always, you're going to answer some questions on a Schoology quiz when you are finished. So now we're going to continue on with chapter 7, part 2, The Sounding of the Call. As the fall of the year came on, the moose appeared in greater abundance, moving slowly down to meet the winter in the lower and less rigorous valleys. Buck had already dragged down a stray part-grown calf, but he wished strongly for a larger and more formidable quarry, and he came upon it one day on the divide at the head of the creek. A band of 20 moose had crossed over from the land of streams and timber, and chief among them was a great bull. He was in a savage temper, and standing over 6 feet from the ground, was as formidable an antagonist as even Buck could desire. Back and forth the bull tossed his great palmated antlers, branching to 14 points, and embracing 7 feet within the tips. His small eyes burned with a vicious and bitter light, while he roared with fury at the sight of Buck. All right, so Buck at this point is now completely fearless and almost completely wild, and he's not afraid of taking down a moose that is at least 6 feet tall with antlers that spread 7 feet wide. This is a very, very, very dangerous animal, and Buck is not afraid of him at this point. From the bull's side, just forward of the flank, protruded a feathered arrow end, which accounted for his savageness. Guided by that instinct which came from the old hunting days of the primordial world, Buck proceeded to cut the bull out from the herd. It was no slight task. He would bark and dance about in front of the bull, just out of reach of the great antlers and of the terrible splay hooves, which could have stamped his life out with a single blow. Unable to turn his back on the fanged danger and go on, the bull would be driven into paroxysms of rage. At such moments he charged Buck, who retreated craftily, luring him on by a simulated inability to escape. But when he was thus separated from his fellows, 2 or 3 of the younger bulls would charge back upon Buck and enable the wounded bull to rejoin the herd. So at this point, the bull is injured, and Buck is able to kind of lure him away from the rest of his herd so that he could single him out to hunt him down. There is a patience of the wildest, dogged, tireless persistence as life itself that holds motionless for endless hours the spider in its web, the snake in its coils, the panther in its ambuscade. This patience belongs particularly to life when it hunts its living food, and it belonged to Buck as he clung to the flank of the herd, retarding its march, irritating the young bulls, worrying the cows with their half-grown calves, and driving the wounded bull mad with helpless rage. For half a day this continued. Buck multiplied himself, attacking from all sides, enveloping the herd in a whirlwind of menace, cutting out his victim as fast as he could rejoin its mates, wearing out the patience of the creatures preyed upon, which is a lesser patience than that of the creatures preying. As the day wore along and the sun dropped to its bed in the northwest, the darkness had come back, and the fall nights were 6 hours long. The young bulls retraced their steps more and more reluctantly to the aid of their beset leader. The downcoming winter was hurrying them on to the lower levels, and it seemed they could never shake off this tireless creature that held them back. Besides, it was not the life of the herd or of the young bulls that was threatened. The life of only one member was demanded, by which was a remoter interest than their lives, and in the end they were content to pay the toll. As twilight fell, the old bull stood, with lowered head, matching his mates, the cows he had known, the calves he had fathered, the bulls he had mastered. As they shambled on at a rapid pace through the fading light, he could not follow, for before his nose leapt the merciless fanged terror that would not let him go. 300 weight more than half a ton he weighed. He had lived a long, strong life, full of fight and struggle, and at the end he faced death at the teeth of a creature whose head did not reach beyond his great knuckled knees. So by this point, the other moose in the herd have decided that losing one of its members is worth the price, so they abandon the bull, and now Buck is free to take this moose down because he's now solitary and he's by himself. From then on, night and day, Buck never left his prey, never gave it a moment's rest, never permitted it to browse the leaves or trees or the shoots of young birch and willow, nor did he give the wounded bull opportunity to slake his burning thirst in the slender, trickling streams they crossed. Often, in desperation, he burst into long stretches of flight. At such times Buck did not attempt to stay him, but loped easily at his heels, satisfied with the way the game was played, lying down when the moose stood still, attacking him fiercely when he strove to eat or drink. The great head drooped more and more under its tree of horns, and the shambling trot grew weak and weaker. He took to standing for long periods, with nose to the ground and dejected ears drooped limply, and Buck found more time in which to get water for himself in which to rest. At such moments, panting with red lolling tongue, and with eyes fixed upon the big bull, it appeared to Buck that a change was coming over the face of things. He could feel a new stir in the land. As the moose were coming into the land, other kinds of life were coming in. Forest and stream and air seemed palpitant with their presence. The news of it was borne in upon him, not by sight or sound or smell, but by some other and subtler sense. He heard nothing, saw nothing, yet knew that the land was somehow different, that through it strange things were afoot and raging, and he resolved to investigate after he had finished the business in hand. So basically, at this point, he's allowing the bull to weaken himself, and Buck will take rest as the bull is running around weakening himself out. And because Buck is able to rest, when the bull finally weakens down, Buck is going to be able to attack him. But Buck also knows that something is changing in the landscape. He doesn't know what it is, He doesn't know, why it's happening, but he knows something is different. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of what is going to happen by the end of this chapter. At last, at the end of the fourth day, he pulled the great moose down. For a day and a night he remained by the kill, eating and sleeping, turn and turn about. Then rested, refreshed, and strong, he turned his face toward camp and John Thornton. He broke into the long, easy lope and went on hour after hour, never at loss for the tangled way, heading straight home through the strange country with a certitude of direction that put man and his magnetic needle to shame. So after 4 days of chasing the moose down and sitting with him and eating and lavishing in the kill, he is still able to magically, through this wonderful sense of direction that he has, find his way back to John Thornton's camp. As he held on, he became more and more conscious of the new stir in the land. There was life abroad in it different from the life which had been there throughout the summer. No longer was this fact borne in upon him in some subtle, mysterious way. The birds talked of it, the squirrels chattered about it, the very breeze whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew in a fresh morning air in great sniffs, reading a message which made him leap on with greater speed. He was oppressed with a sense of calamity happening, if it were not calamity already happened, and as he crossed the last watershed and dropped down into the valley toward the camp, he proceeded with greater caution. 3 miles away he came upon a fresh trail that sent his neck hair rippling and bristling. It led straight toward camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on, swiftly and stealthily, every nerve straining and tense, alert to the multitudinous details which told a story all but the end. His nose gave him a varying description of the passage of the life on the heels of which he was traveling. He remarked the pregnant silence of the forest. The bird life had flitted. The squirrels were in hiding. Only he saw, and a sleek gray fellow flattened against a gray dead limb, so that he seemed a part of it, a woody excrescence upon the wood itself. So basically, at this point, Buck senses danger on his way back to camp. He's smelling things that have never been in this area before, and he's not quite sure what to do with it, so he proceeds with caution. As Buck slid along with the obscureness of a gliding shadow, his nose was jerked suddenly to the side as though a positive force had gripped and pulled it. He followed the new scent into a thicket and found Nig. He was laying on his side, dead where he had dragged himself, an arrow protruding, head and feathers, from either side of his body. 100 yards farther on, Buck came upon one of the sled dogs Thornton had bought at Dawson. This dog was thrashing about in a death struggle directly on the trail, and Buck passed around him without stopping. From the camp came the faint sound of many voices rising and falling in a sing-song chant. Bellying forward to the edge of the clearing, he found Hans lying on his face, feathered with arrows like a porcupine. At the same instant Buck peered out where the Spruce Bough Lodge had been and saw what made his hair leap straight up on his neck and shoulders. A gust of overpowering rage swept over him. He did not know that he growled, but he growled aloud with a terrible ferocity. For the last time in his life he allowed passion to usurp cunning and reason, and it was because of his great love for John Thornton that he lost his head. So at this point, something has killed Nig, the other dogs, and Hans, and now Buck is getting all of these things. We're getting arrows in these animals, so we should pretty much be able to foreshadow at this point that a local Native American tribe has come into the area and has pretty much started killing people and animals in this camp. We don't know why, but this is kind of what's happening. The Yehats were dancing about the wreckage of the Spruce Bough Lodge when they heard a fearful roaring and saw rushing upon them an animal the like of which they had never seen before. It was Buck, a live hurricane of fury, hurling himself upon them in a frenzy to destroy. He sprang at the foremost man. It was the chief of the Yehats, ripping the throat wide open till the rent jugular sprouted a fountain of blood. He did not pause to worry the victim, but ripped in passing, with the next bound tearing wide the throat of a second man. There was no withstanding him. He plunged about in their very midst, tearing, rending, destroying in constant and terrific motion, which defied the arrows they discharged at him. In fact, so inconceivably rapid were his movements, and so closely were the Indians tangled together that they shot one another with arrows, and one young hunter hurling a spear at Buck in midair drove it through the chest of another hunter with such force that the point broke through the skin of the back and stood out beyond. When a panic seized the Yeehats, they fled in terror to the woods, proclaiming as they fled the advent of the evil spirit. So at this point, Buck loses his mind at the thought of losing Thornton, and he goes on this like vicious attack, trying to kill all of these men. And now, when they flee, Buck is going to follow them because he not only has defended his camp, but now he wants revenge. And truly Buck was the fiend incarnate, raging at their heels and dragging them down like deer as they raced through the trees. It was a fateful day for the Yeehats. They scattered far and wide over the country, and it was not till a week later that the last of the survivors gathered together in a lower valley and counted their losses. As for Buck, weary of the pursuit, he returned to the desolated camp. He found Pete where he had been killed in his blankets in the first moment of surprise. Thornton's desperate struggle was fresh written on the earth, and Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of a deep pool. By the edge, head and forefeet in the water, lay Skeet, faithful to the last. The pool itself, muddy and discolored from the sluice boxes, effectually hid what it contained, and it contained John Thornton. For Buck followed his trace into the water, from which no trace led away. So Thornton, in an attempt to get away in the attack, is killed, and Skeet stays with him until he dies. Thornton dies, that is. All day Buck brooded by the pool or roamed restlessly about the camp. Death, as a cessation of movement, as a passing out and away from the lives of the living, he knew, and he knew John Thornton was dead. It left a great void in him, somewhat akin to hunger, but a void which ached, and which food could not fill at times when he paused to contemplate the carcasses of the Yeehats. He forgot the pain of it, and at such times he was aware of a great pride in himself, a pride greater than any he had yet experienced. He had killed man, the noblest game of all, and he had killed in the face of the law of club and fang. He sniffed the bodies curiously. They had died so easily. It was harder to kill a husky dog than them. They were no match at all. Were it not for their arrows and spears and clubs, thenceforward he would be unafraid of them except when they bore in their hands their arrows, spears, and clubs. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees into the sky, lighting the land till it lay bathed in ghostly day. And with the coming of the night, brooding and mourning by the pool, Buck became alive to a stirring of the new life in the forest other than that which the Yeehats had made. He stood up, listening and scenting. From far away drifted a faint, sharp yelp, followed by a chorus of similar sharp yelps. As the moments passed, the yelps grew closer and louder. Again Buck knew them as things heard in that other world which persisted in his memory. He walked to the center of the open space and listened. It was the call, the many-noted call, sounding more alluringly and compellingly than ever before. And as never before he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broken. Man and the claims of man no longer bound him. So because John Thornton is dead, Buck no longer has a master or love for a person at this point. He is now his own master, and he is free to do whatever he wants. And this needed to happen in order for Buck to become truly wild. And that is one of your questions tonight. So that is something you need to think about. Why does John Thornton have to die in order for Buck to to become completely wild? Hunting their living meat as the Yeehats were hunting it on the flanks of the migrating moose, the wolf pack had at last crossed over from the land of streams and timber and invaded Buck's Valley. Into the clearing where the moonlight streamed they poured in a silvery flood, and in the center of the clearing stood Buck, motionless as a statue, waiting their coming. They were awed. So still and large he stood, and a moment's pause fell, till the boldest one leapt straight for him. Like a flash Buck struck, breaking the neck. Then he stood without movement, as before the stricken wolf rolling in agony behind him. Three others tried it in sharp succession, and one after the other they drew back streaming blood from slashed throats or shoulders. So at this point, they're kind of trying to initiate Buck into the pack and see what he is going to do or capable of doing. If they can drive him away, then they will. But at this point, he's starting to kill pack members. So they realize he's too strong for that. This was sufficient to fling the whole pack forward pell-mell, crowded together, blocked and confused by its eagerness to pull down the prey. Buck's marvelous quickness and agility stood him in good stead. Pivoting on his legs and snapping and gashing, he was everywhere at once, presenting a front which was apparently unbroken, so swiftly did he whirl and guard from side to side. But to prevent them from getting behind him, he was forced back, down past the pool and into the creek bed, till he brought up against a high gravel bank. He worked along to a right angle in the bank which the men had made in the course of mining, and in this angle he came to bay, protected on three sides, and with nothing to do but face the front. And so well he did face it, that at the end of half an hour the wolves drew back discomfited. The tongues of all were out and lolling, the white fangs showing cruelly white in the moonlight. Some were lying down with heads raised and ears pricked forward, others stood on their feet watching him, and still others were lapping water from the pool. One wolf, long and lean and gray, advanced cautiously in a friendly manner, and Buck recognized the wild brother with whom he had run for a night and a day. He was whining softly, and as Buck whined they touched noses. Then an old wolf, gaunt and battle-scarred, came forward. Buck writhed his lips into a preliminary of a snarl, but sniffed noses with him, whereupon the old wolf sat down, pointed nose at the moon, and broke out into a long wolf howl. The others sat down and howled, and now the call came to Buck in unmistakable accents. He too sat down and howled. This over, he came out of his angle, and the pack crowded around him, sniffing in half friendly, half savage manner. The leaders lifted the yelp of the pack and sprang away into the woods. The wolves swung in behind, yelping in chorus, and Buck ran with them side by side with the wild brother yelping as he ran. So finally, after all of this time, Buck has finally completed his journey to the wild. He is accepted by the wolf pack, and now he has a new wild family that he has never had before. He had a family of men before, and now he has a family of wolves. And this is the epilogue. And here may well end the story of Buck. The years were not many when the Yeehats noted a change in the breed of timber wolves, for some were seen with splashes of brown on head and muzzle, and with a rift of white centering down the chest. But more remarkable than this, the Yeehats tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog, for it has cunning greater than they, stealing from their camps in fierce winters, robbing their traps, slaying their dogs, and defying their bravest hunters. So the local tribes notice that the wolves' appearances start to change over time, indicating that Buck is mating with the female wolves in this pack, and they're creating this new wolf-dog hybrid that looks like a wolf and has the coloring of Buck. Nay, the tale grows worse. Hunters there are who fail to return to the camp, and hunters there have been whom their tribesmen found their throats slashed cruelly open and with wolf prints about them in the snow greater than the prints of any wolf. Each fall, when the Yeehats follow the movement of the moose, there is a certain valley which they never enter, and women are there are who become sad when the word goes over the fire of how the evil spirit came to select that valley for an abiding place. So Buck is still spoken of by this tribe for the damage that he did after they attacked John Thornton's camp, and he has become very much like a superstition or a legend at this point. In the summers there is one visitor, however, to the valley of which the Yeehats do not know. It is a great, gloriously coated wolf-like and yet unlike all other wolves. It crosses alone from the smiling timber land and comes down into an open space among the trees. Here a yellow stream flows from rotted moose hide and sacks and sinks into the ground with long grasses growing through it and vegetable mold overrunning it and hiding its yellow from the sun. And here he muses for a time, howling once long and mournfully ere he departs. But he is not always alone. When the long winter nights come on and the wolves follow their meat into the lower valleys, he may be seen running at the head of the pack through the pale moonlight, or glimmering borealis leaping gigantic above his fellows, his great throat a bellow as he sings a song of the younger world, which is the song of the pack. So Buck still returns to the valley where Thornton and his camp were. He still returns there every year. He returns sometimes with his pack, sometimes alone, and he hunts with the rest of the wolves, and he is finally content and happy at this point. So as I said before, you are just going to look at this idea of why does John Thornton need to die for Buck to become wild? Death is the only thing that could make this this happen for Buck, that he is completely able to throw off domestic life and become wild. So once again, I want you to use two direct details, and at least one of them must be a quote. You can talk about details that have happened in previous chapters if you want, but the quote should come from this chapter. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed reading this novel as much as I enjoyed reading it to you and teaching you. Good luck with the rest of your Schoology quiz. And this is the last installment. Have a great day.